Lady Colin Campbell's husband tried to erase her in open court, claiming she wasn't legally a woman. He lost. Then she wrote a book about Diana so accurate, Buckingham Palace spent months trying to bury it. But she was right. For 50 years, the royal family has tried to silence her. They still haven't managed it. That's not luck. That's outsmarting them. Every good campaign begins with an advantage nobody else can see. And Lady Colin Campbell's advantage began rather remarkably with a mistake. She was born Georgia Ariana Ziadi on the 17th of August, 1949, in Kingston, Jamaica, into a wealthy Lebanese-Jamaican merchant family called the Ziadis, the sort of family that attended the right parties, sat in the right pews, and had opinions about who else was permitted to do the same. Refined, ambitious, thoroughly respectable in the way that only families with something to prove tend to be. But at her birth, a medical error occurred. A congenital condition led doctors to misregister her sex, and she was recorded, incorrectly, as male. It was a clerical catastrophe that would follow her for decades, one that most people would have spent a lifetime trying to hide. Lady Colin, as we shall see, did something considerably braver. She let the world find out on her own terms, in her own time, and eventually, when the establishment tried to use it against her, in a courtroom, on television, and in the pages of her own memoirs. There is a particular kind of power in refusing to be ashamed of the thing everyone expects you to hide. She discovered that power early, and she never once relinquished it. Educated in the Caribbean, sharp as a blade even as a girl, she arrived in London in her 20s with almost nothing but her wit, her manners, and an absolutely bottomless reserve of nerve. And London, as London does with people of genuine magnetism, opened its doors to her rather quickly. She moved through the gilded circuits of British high society, the sort of drawing rooms and dinner tables where Tatler photographers lurked and everyone knew, or pretended to know, exactly who everyone else was. She was witty. She was glamorous. She had the rare and slightly unnerving gift of making whoever she was speaking to feel like the most fascinating person in the room, while quietly cataloguing every detail around her with the precision of a woman who understood, instinctively, that information is the only currency that never devalues. And it was here, in these rooms, that she began her true education. Not in etiquette, which she'd already mastered, but in power. She studied the aristocracy the way a naturalist studies a difficult and dangerous species. She learned the rituals. She learned the snobberies. She learned who actually mattered and who merely believed they did. A distinction that in British high society is not always obvious and is very rarely the one printed in the papers. The establishment looked at this striking, quick-witted woman from Jamaica, arriving in their midst, and assumed, as the establishment so often does, that she was there to be absorbed, smoothed down, made presentable, married off and quietly filed away. They had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. In 1974, Georgia married Lord Colin Campbell, the younger son of the 11th Duke of Argyll, heir to one of the most storied titles in the whole of Scotland. On paper, it was precisely the kind of match that raised a carefully plucked eyebrow across every drawing room in London. A striking, Jamaican-born woman marrying directly into Scottish ducal aristocracy. Some called it a triumph. Others, rather more quietly, called it something else entirely. They were both, in their own ways, correct, because the marriage was, almost from its very first weeks, a nightmare. Lady Colin has spoken with considerable candour about her former husband's violence, and within a year she had done what remarkably few women of her era, in her position, dared to do. She left. Now here is where the establishment made its first serious miscalculation, because Lord Colin, rather than accepting the end of the marriage with anything resembling dignity, decided to fight, and the weapon he chose was the very thing Georgia had spent her whole life managing, with quiet, formidable discipline. He sought to have the marriage annulled on the grounds that she had been registered male at birth. It was a calculated, brutal move, designed to drag her most private and painful history into open court, for the entertainment of Fleet Street and the mortification of everyone who'd ever shaken her hand at a party. The newspapers naturally could not believe their luck. This was precisely the sort of scandal that sold papers by the 100,000. Salacious, unprecedented, dripping with the kind of establishment discomfort that journalists dream about. Reporters camped outside the courts. Barristers on both sides prepared for what would become one of the most talked about legal battles of the decade. And here is the part the establishment did not see coming. Georgia did not shrink from it. She did not retreat, settle quietly, or beg for privacy she'd never be granted. She fought. She assembled a formidable legal case, endured months of the most invasive scrutiny imaginable, and walked into that courtroom prepared to do what almost nobody in her position, in 1970s Britain, had the resources or the sheer nerve to attempt. She won. The court found in her favour, establishing in law precisely what she had always known to be true, that she was a woman, in full, and that no clerical error from a Jamaican hospital in 1949 was going to override that fact, whatever her husband's barristers might argue. It was a landmark case. It cost her enormously. The scars of that trial, by her own account, never entirely healed. But consider for a moment what actually happened here. An aristocratic family attempted to use the courts to erase her identity, and by extension, her claim to the title she'd married into. They assumed she would either lose or vanish under the weight of public humiliation. She did neither. She stood in the one arena where the establishment believed it held every advantage, the British legal system, presided over by men who looked and sounded exactly like the family trying to destroy her, and she beat them at their own game. She kept the title, she kept her name, and she walked out of that courtroom as Lady Colin Campbell, which, whatever the Campbells might have preferred, she has remained ever since. That was move one. The establishment had absolutely no idea there would be several more. By the late 1980s, Lady Colin Campbell had become a fixture of a particular kind of London social world, the sort where champagne flowed with real regularity, discretion was strictly optional, and everybody knew everybody else's secrets, but only ever spoke them in careful whispers. She moved through those circles collecting stories the way other women collect fine china, and she was already demonstrating, quite unmistakably, that she was not a woman who could be patronised, dismissed, or gently ushered to the margins. But it was her pen in the end that would prove the most dangerous thing about her. In 1992, at precisely the moment the fairy tale of the Prince and Princess of Wales's marriage was visibly publicly crumbling, Lady Colin published Diana in private, The Princess Nobody Knows. It did not arrive quietly. It arrived like a sledgehammer through a stained glass window. She wrote, with what can only be described as surgical precision, about Diana's private struggles with bulimia, about the crushing loneliness of life inside the royal machine, about affairs, about alleged suicide attempts, about the cold institutional indifference of a family that had never quite known what to do with the luminous, combustible young woman Charles had brought into their midst, and most explosively of all, about a marriage that had collapsed long before the public had been permitted to suspect it. Buckingham Palace reacted with something very close to panic. Courtiers briefed furiously against the book. Certain commentators dismissed it as tabloid gossip, dressed up in a hardback jacket, the sort of thing one simply didn't discuss at dinner. Invitations that had once arrived for Lady Colin with clockwork regularity began quite suddenly to dry up entirely. Doors that had swung open with a smile now remained very firmly, very politely, closed. Here is where the establishment made its second miscalculation, and this one was rather more serious than the first, because it involved underestimating not her nerve, but her accuracy. Because a great deal of what Lady Colin wrote in 1992 was subsequently confirmed by Diana herself. First in Andrew Morton's biography that same year, and then unmistakably in the princess's own words during that extraordinary Panorama interview in November 1995, watched by more than 20 million people in stunned silence. Lady Colin, it turned out, had not been inventing scandal. She had simply been telling the truth roughly 3 years before anyone else in Britain had the nerve to say it out loud. Think about what that means. The palace strategy, the one deployed against every unwelcome royal biographer for generations, was always the same. Deny, discredit. Wait for the story to fade and let the author's reputation absorb the damage instead. It had worked, more or less reliably, for decades. It did not work this time because the story didn't fade. It was corroborated publicly by the one person whose word the palace could never successfully dispute, the Princess of Wales herself. The doors that had shut on Lady Colin began, in time, to reopen because, as she has noted since with the particular dry relish she brings to nearly everything, Closed doors in British high society have a rather useful habit of swinging back open once the dust has settled, and everyone remembers who was right. The book sold in the millions, translated into dozens of languages, and Lady Colin Campbell emerged from the wreckage of that establishment backlash as something the palace genuinely had not budgeted for. The most fearless and arguably the most accurate royal biographer of her generation. The establishment, having failed to silence Lady Colin through the courts and failed again through social exile, tried a rather different approach over the years that followed. Ridicule. Her long-running, gloriously bitter public feud with Princess Michael of Kent kept the gossip columns extremely well fed for years. A war of finely worded mutual disdain that only two women raised within touching distance of royalty could truly execute with full theatrical effect. It was catty. It was entertaining. And it did precisely nothing to diminish Lady Colin's standing because, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, controversy, for a woman who has never once apologised for existing loudly, is not a liability. It is oxygen. Then, in 2015, came a move that genuinely wrong-footed almost everyone watching. Lady Colin Campbell, then in her mid-60s, entered the Australian jungle for "I'm a celebrity, get me out of here." The producers, one rather suspects, were anticipating a certain kind of television. The grande dame slightly out of her depth, ruffled by bugs and bad food, and reality television's relentless demand for manufactured intimacy. What they got instead was an absolute masterclass in refusing to perform vulnerability on demand. She clashed magnificently with fellow campmates. She delivered withering one-line observations with the comic timing of a seasoned actress who had, frankly, been performing for the British public her entire adult life. She became one of the single most talked-about contestants the programme had produced in years. She left the jungle early, but on her own terms, head held high, which, if you have been paying attention to this story at all, is really the only way Lady Colin Campbell has ever left anywhere. Here is the strategic brilliance the establishment consistently failed to grasp about her. Series after series, decade after decade. Every attempt to embarrass her, the annulment trial, the social freeze-out after Diana, the reality television gauntlet designed to strip away dignity for entertainment, she simply absorbed and then repurposed as material. Nothing thrown at Lady Colin Campbell has ever actually damaged her for very long, because she has never needed the establishment's approval to survive. She only ever needed an audience willing to listen, and Britain, rather magnificently, has never once stopped providing one. Now, if you've been enjoying this story so far, this is exactly the moment to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next one. And do drop a comment below telling us what you make of Lady Colin so far. We read every single one, and we'd genuinely love to know whether you think the establishment ever really stood a chance. Right, back to the story, because the very best is still ahead. By 2021, Lady Colin Campbell was well into her 70s, and if the palace had allowed itself a moment of quiet relief, the assumption that its most persistent and accurate biographer had perhaps finally retired to her garden, that relief was about to be spectacularly premature. She published Meghan and Harry, the real story, and the timing was, to put it mildly, extraordinary. The book landed just months before the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's now legendary interview with Oprah Winfrey, a broadcast that shook the modern monarchy in ways it had not been shaken since Diana's own Panorama appearance a quarter of a century earlier. Lady Colin's book made claims that were pointed, specific, and, crucially, entirely unafraid of controversy. She alleged, among other things, that it was Meghan who had made Kate cry ahead of the wedding, directly inverting the sympathetic version of events that had circulated for years. She wrote that the Sussex departure from royal duties had been a far more complicated, contentious and bitterly negotiated affair behind palace walls than any official statement had ever admitted. Whether one accepts every detail of her account or approaches it, as some understandably did, with a raised eyebrow, the sheer timing was remarkable, and the level of specific detail was the kind that simply does not come from guesswork. The book became a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, placing Lady Colin once again at the very centre of one of the biggest royal controversies in living memory. In a reign that has weathered no shortage of them, that is no small achievement. And here at last is the strategy laid bare in full. The palace's oldest and most reliable weapon against unwelcome biographers has always been time. The assumption that any scandal, however sharp, eventually gets buried beneath the next one. But Lady Colin Campbell has spent 5 decades proving that this weapon does not work against her, because she has never been playing a single round. She has been playing the long game, publishing again and again, precisely when the establishment least expected to hear from her, and being right often enough that dismissing her outright became, over time, simply too risky a strategy for anyone at the palace to rely on. They never saw it coming, not because she was loud, she was always loud, but because they kept assuming the last controversy would be the one that finally quietened her. It never was. It never has been. Let's return for a moment to that courtroom in the 1970s, to a young woman standing alone against a ducal family's barristers, fighting to keep a name and a title that a great many powerful people believed she had no business holding on to. What nobody in that courtroom could possibly have foreseen, because it hadn't happened yet, because it couldn't have been predicted by anyone watching, was that this was never really a fight about a marriage, or a title, or even a birth certificate. It was the opening move in a campaign that would run for the best part of half a century, one aimed not at any single institution, but at the entire British establishment's assumption that women like her were meant to be managed, contained, and eventually forgotten. She was not managed, she was not contained, and she has quite pointedly never once been forgotten. Consider the full shape of what actually happened here. The courts tried to strip her identity in open trial. She won, and kept both. High society tried to freeze her out after Diana. She outlasted the freeze, and was vindicated by the princess herself. The tabloids tried to reduce her to a punchline through a jungle reality show. She turned it into one of the most memorable series that programme ever produced. And when the palace assumed, in its quieter moments, that a woman in her 70s posed no further threat to the official narrative, she published a book so well-timed, it landed practically alongside the Sussexes' own reckoning with the institution. Each attempt to diminish her became, in her hands, another chapter in a story that only grew larger with every passing decade. It is not that Lady Colin Campbell defeated the royal family in any single decisive confrontation. Nobody does that, not really. Not even Diana herself managed it cleanly. It is that she simply refused, for 50 years, to let the institution write the ending of her story on its own terms. And an institution built entirely on control, on managing narratives, on controlling access, on deciding whose version of events gets to survive, has never quite worked out what to do with a woman who was always, calmly, quietly, one full move ahead. She lives now at her own Leeds castle, not the famous one in Kent, but her own rather magnificent home, where she tends her garden, writes her books, and records her own popular YouTube channel with precisely the same unguarded frankness that has defined every year of her extraordinarily public life. She receives visitors with the sort of gracious, unbought authority that simply cannot be inherited or purchased. It can only be earned by surviving decade after decade, the very institution that once tried its hardest to make her disappear. There is something genuinely moving about watching a woman who was knocked down so many times, by courts, by the press, by an establishment that never once knew quite what to do with her, simply, stubbornly, refuse to stay down. She has outlasted most of her detractors. She has watched reputations that once seemed untouchable curdle in the public eye, while her own, battered as it undoubtedly is, has acquired the particular lustre that only genuine, hard-won resilience can produce. The royal family, for all its centuries of careful narrative management, never quite managed to outmaneuver Lady Colin Campbell, and at 76 years old, with a career built entirely on being underestimated, one rather suspects, one rather hopes. She isn't finished proving that yet. There's a line worth sitting with as we close this one out. Lady Colin has said, more than once, that she never wrote a single word she didn't believe to be true, and that the world, sooner or later, always caught up with her. That's really the whole story, isn't it? Not the courtroom win, not the bestsellers, not even the jungle. The real story is a woman who was told, again and again, by people with every institutional advantage on their side, that she would eventually be quietened, and who simply, calmly, decade after decade, declined to be. If you enjoyed this one, do give it a like. Drop a comment below telling us what surprised you most. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss the next story. We've got another one queued up on your screen right now that we think you'll love just as much. Thank you, as ever, for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.